Hello everybody, Samurai Carl here, bringing you a standard meta breakdown of Azorius Control. Been playing this deck for a couple weeks here in a standard best of 3 and MTG Arena. Don't normally play Control, but this is probably one of the best decks out there right now, and I've really had a great time playing it. And this one I kind of go over the current matchups, how to sideboard in current situations, and then just kind of a basic breakdown of Azorius Control. So let's move into my current deck list. So, pretty standard Azorius Shell, Teferi, Narset, Elsbeth Conquers Death, and Dream Trawler as my main game closer. Bunch of counter magic and answers to different things your opponent might throw at you. Has a great suite of utility spells and just general answers to pretty much anything you're running into in standard. So let's move on to this deck's current threats. So you have Teferi, Narset, and Dream Trawler. Archon of the Sun's Grace is a great threat as well, but I do not have it mainboard right now. I like to sideboard it in just because I don't want them to see it game one, just because they will leave some of the removal in to deal with it. So I like to play it, game 2, game 3, because most of the time they cut their removal because the removal is not very effective against Azorius Control. Teferi and Narset aren't game winners, but they are must answers. They're going to slow down your opponent's game. They're going to shut off any draw engines and dig for spells and answers to other threats they might want to put out. So, and then Dream Trawler is my game closer for sure. Very hard to deal with threat, has lifelink, can be pumped pretty easily with a lot of the draw spells in the deck. So great overall threat and game closer. So for your answers in Azorius Control, when I'm using Absorb and Dovin's Veto for your permission, your counter spells. Absorb is a great overall counter. The fact that it gains 3 life is amazing, especially with a lot of the aggro matchups running around. That 3 life can be make or break. And then Dovin's Veto is a great non-creature counter. And most of the time, if you're countering a planeswalker, they're not going to be able to stop it because it is uncounterable. And then your board wipes for your aggro matchups, and then Banishing Light is a kind of good overall utility answer to pretty much anything you want to remove from the board. And then for utility spells, I have Elsbeth Conquers Death on this list under utility spells just because it is more of a utility spell than a removal. A lot of times you're going to play it without the exile of 3 or greater just because there isn't a target, because you might want to get one of your Dream Trawlers back or another one of your threats back, maybe Teferi or Narset. So just jamming this without it actually being exiling something is usually useful as well. Omen of the Sea, great draw spell, great stack in your deck. And then Birth of Miletus is great for fixing your mana, getting you that wall to kind of dirtle up the board state so you don't get run over by aggro decks. And then Thirst for Meeting is an overall great draw spell, especially in an enchantment heavy deck like this one. So kind of want to go over utility lanes as well. There's a bunch of castles and Field of Ruin in this list. Arden Vale's great for pumping out tokens, for blocking, or for running over your opponent if you just can't dig up that threat in a timely manner. And then Ventress is great for stacking your deck, just scrying on those off turns where you don't really have much to do with your mana. And then again, Field of Ruin is just the answer for any opposing utility lands or for trying to cut off your opponent's mana if you can cut them out of a color. Pretty great for that. Let's move on to the bounce synergy with Teferi and your enchantments. Now, I've noticed this with a lot of pros is they'll end up bouncing their own enchantments more than they'll bounce the opponent's permanents. And a lot of times, like bouncing something your opponent has on board is not as beneficial as bouncing, let's say, an Omen of the Sea and replaying it, or Banishing Light and replaying it. Omen of the Sea, generally, you pick it back up and replay it, you're going to get that draw. So on the bounce, you get a draw, and then on the replay, you get a scry and a draw 1. So 2 card advantage off that synergy right there. Really nice. And then Banishing Light, I've actually done this where I've like banished a smaller creature, and then I've gotten a board wipe later on. I just bounce the Banishing Light if I have a Teferi on board, put that creature back on the board, and then, you know, clear the board out with a Shatter the Sky, and then I have that Banishing Light for another threat later on. And then in a pinch, if you really need to, you can bounce your Elsbeth Conquers Death and rebanish another permanent or threat that's, you know, needs to be removed from the board. Really good synergy with Teferi and his -3. Bouncing these permanents are probably more beneficial than bouncing your opponent sometimes. So do keep in mind that, you know, this is a pretty good synergy with this deck. All right, so let's move on to matchups. I'm first going to go over the aggro matchups. Your red deck wins mono white, mono green, your Gruul aggro, Simic Ramp, Simic Flash. Simic Ramp and Flash are kind of a more aggro-y mid-range, but they can cause problems, and your board wipes and Birth of Mildness are really effective against them. So these spells great in this matchup. I ended up siding in more Banishing Lights just to deal with these threats in these matchups for sure. So what I would cut in these aggro matchups, I normally would cut Elsbeth Conquers Death just because I might not cut it completely, but I'll cut down to 1 or 2, and then Dovin's Veto if they're really creature heavy and they're not going to be playing non-creature spells. And then you can cut back 1 or 2 Teferis if you need the spots. And then this is all subjective on what you're trying to board in and what matchup you're particularly playing against, because some of these spells are effective against certain aggro matches. It's just really dependent on what you're playing against. But in general, you can consider these 3 cards to cut to put in your sideboard cards for the aggro matchup. As for boarding in, I would look at these spells if you have them in your sideboard, and then this is what I'm running. So I normally put in more Banishing Lights and then Archon for sure. And then if I need to, depending on what deck I'm playing against, if Devout Decree is very effective because it's a black or red deck, I'd put those in. And then Ether Gust if it's, you know, a red or green deck for more bounce or removal for delay for sure. And the cool thing about this is you can, with Ether Gust, is you can target the spell on the stack and return it. That way if it has any enter the battlefield triggers, it'll prevent that as well. So let's go over the mid-range and combo matchups. So I would consider like Temur Reclamation, Temur Adventure, Jund Sacrifice, Simic, Flash, Gorgulary Sacrifice, Rakdos Oven, any of the kind of slower mid-rangey decks. Really useful are your permission spells like Absorb and Dovin's Veto, and Banishing Light for just kind of dealing with any general threats that hit the board. As for sideboarding and what to cut, I mean, this can really subjective depending on what you're playing. So in some matchups you want to cut Birth of Mildness just because it's not very useful. They're a little slower. The walls, you know, aren't really going to save you much life because they either have flyers or just bigger threats that trample over your wall. And then another kind of consideration is Eldos Conquer Death because it might be too slow or doesn't hit permanents that you're trying to get rid of, and Teferi if they're not trying to interact with you at instant speed. I wouldn't cut them out like Teferi entirely. I'd cut back on them. Same thing with Omen the Sea, because having those are really useful. You can cut back on them if you need slots as well. So I'd consider these cards to cut back on during the mid-range combo matchup, depending on, you know, what you're trying to board in and which one of these 4 cards is more effective in that particular matchup or less effective. So, and this is what I would try to board in. More Banishing Light scores because they're kind of just a good catch-all. Dovin's Veto if they have a lot of non-creature permanents they're trying to jam, and then Mystical Dispute is great for the mid-range decks that splash blue. So if they have other blue spells that, you know, either other counters or planeswalkers, it's great for just countering those. And then Whirlwind Denial is a great overall card for the combo deck. So if they have a lot of triggers on the stack, you can literally shut down their combo by just casting a spell and pretty much exiling all of their abilities on the stack and pretty much shutting them down. So that's a nice card to have. Control matchups and the mirror. So Teferi and Narset are really good in these matchups just because they're going to lock down the instant speed interaction and they're going to shut off their card draw. Again, with Shatter the Sky, it's more for their threats that are hard to answer. So if they're playing an opposing like Dream Trawler, Shatter the Sky is pretty much the only way you're going to be able to deal with it, other than either running it over or running them out of cards so you can actually target it before they can make it hexproof. And then for the other matchups, these are overall just good cards to shut down, you know, the instant speed interaction and their card draw for sure. All right, moving on. What to cut in the control and mirror matchups. So I end up cutting a lot of my permission, like my counter spells. You ended up just not being able to use them because of Teferi. If they don't play Teferi, you're okay to keep these, but really depending on the matchup. For the mirror, you definitely want to get rid of your counters and just play more threats and more, you know, sorcery speed answers to things. Because if they jam a Teferi, you're gonna have to play through it, and you don't want a lot of dead cards in your hand if a Teferi hits the board. And for Elspeth Conquers Death, you can always consider to cut this if it's too slow or just doesn't hit targets, really depending. And I wouldn't cut it all the way out just because it can recur a threat if you end up losing your Dream Trawler or one of your Archons or one of your Planeswalkers. So control meter and matchups and what to board in. I would say Archon of the Sun's Grace is great to kind of put pressure on them. Banishing Light for dealing with threats at sorcery speed, and then Mystical Dispute for trying to counter those early game Teferis. So, you know, or countering other maybe problematic blue spells with very little mana up. So let's go over just kind of a brief overview. This deck is really heavily reliant on the Teferi Noset combo, just slowing your opponent down, shutting off their draw engine, and then using their answers and board wipes to kind of control the board state, and then closing the game out with the Dream Trawler after they're pretty much shut down. So the deck overall is really effective against the current meta, and I'm going to continue to play it in MTG Arena and hopefully get all the way to Mythic with it in this upcoming season. So I appreciate you guys listening. I do stream, let's see, 3 times a week, Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. I have a full-time job, so I would like to stream more, but it just kind of gets a little tedious, and but you know how it goes. I do like discussing this type of stuff, so if you want to hit me up on my Discord, I'll have my Discord in the description below. Again, if you want to talk to me during my stream days, it's Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. So I appreciate your time. Thanks for hanging out. You guys have a good one.